Yes, it is now. All right. So this is how we'll do this. We'll go through each of the questions, and if somebody disagrees with the response, please unmute yourself and explain why you think the what Kanchi's group has done is wrong. And we'll go through each of them till we have consensus on each of the responses. All right. So number one. So the exercise is that you have to decide whether the statement is an argument, and if it is an argument, highlight the conclusion. All right. So number one, does anybody disagree that the highlighted statement is not the conclusion? Any disagreements? No? Okay. Um, it will be nice if somebody says yes or no, so that I don't feel like I'm alone in this space. So even if you don't agree, you can unmute yourself and say no, we agree, or we disagree, or whatever it is. All right. Okay. Number two. So these guys are saying that number two is not an argument. Does anybody disagree with that?
No.
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 Anybody thinks this is an argument? No group. All groups have got this answer. Have the same response. All right. Okay. Number three. Children who are good at spelling usually have good visual memory. Poor spellers have not learned to look at words carefully. Practice in reading does not necessarily help poor spellers. Is this an argument? First, let's um, consider that question first. Is this an argument?
No.
No? Who said no?
Me, Ishan.
Ishan. Ishan thinks it's not an argument. Why, Ishan?
It doesn't make sense. The consecutive statements, they don't make sense.
Okay, so one second. Kanchi, do you want to explain why you think this is an argument?
Um, uh, yeah, actually, when we were doing it, they're claiming that poor. We thought that the sentence that we have highlighted was the. It's something that they're. We really thought that it was an argument because uh, it's just a second.
Someone can help this group out, all right? If you can explain why this is an argument, you can definitely jump in and explain. Anyone else who thought this is an argument?
Because it's written they usually have a good memory. It's not a fact,
Mm.
and people can argue otherwise.
Mm.
And the
Mm.
second sentence is just an argument supporting the first.
Mm. Mm.
And
Okay, so one way of identifying conclusions is that you generally have words such as thus, therefore, hence, etc., which indicate that something is an argument is being made. Whether or not it's a valid or not is a different story. But if you see some of these words, you can you can identify something as an argument or an attempt at an argument or not. Now, that doesn't mean that you always have to have those words. Sometimes those words are not there, and this could be a sentence where that's the case. But the question is, so there are two or three things you look for when you want to understand if something is an argument or not. You look for words like that. That's the first, immediate kind of step. The other one is to also consider if what you think is a conclusion follows from the premises. So it's not that the conclusion always has to come in the beginning or at the end. Sometimes some people write sentences in a complicated way, and the conclusion is in the middle somewhere. That is also possible. That could be an artistic kind of choice. So the question is whether the statement "poor spellers have not learned to look at words carefully" is something that follows from the other two statements. Now, it could very well be that this what is highlighted is a premise and not a conclusion. Hmm? So it could be, for instance, that poor spellers have not learned to look at words carefully, and therefore children who are good at spelling usually have very good visual memory. Now, would that make sense as an argument or not? Or do you think that the parts of the sentence don't really work with each, with in correspondence to each other? That is essentially what you look for when you think something is an argument or not. So, all right. So now, in the light of these things that I've just said, Kanchi, do you want to change your answer, or um, you are still convinced that this is an argument? Hello?
Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah, sir. I think it's still an argument because the other two statements kind of support it, but
Ishan, have you changed your mind or no? Yes? No?
Confused.
Hmm?
I thought that like the first sentence,
Hmm.
it has a relation between like being good at spelling
Hmm.
and having a good visual memory.
Hmm.
And if we look at these two like parts, and
Hmm.
then the second one then kind of seems to be like a deduction from that,
Hmm.
that not having good spelling,
Hmm.
that means not looking at words properly.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I think the problem here in these three statements is
It
that
seems to be a
uh, the third one talks about practice in reading. Okay, the first one talks about visual memory, and the second one talks about observation or looking at words carefully. Now, the connection between looking at words carefully and visual memory is not so clear cut. You may look at words carefully, but that does not imply that if you look at words carefully you have a good visual memory. Okay,
okay,
so
yeah.
the third sentence, practice in reading, does not have a connection to both visual memory or looking at words carefully, because practice is something that you do, which is over time with repetition and with it's not a skill. Essentially, practice is something that you do. So even though these are sentences which are kind of related to each other, but they don't seem to have logically a connection with each other, right? And the problem is that it doesn't seem like even the three sentences, whoever's written them is not really trying to make a connection by using words like hence and therefore and so on. So I would say that you shouldn't consider this an argument, But again, if somebody has a different view, you can definitely disagree with that. Okay. So anyway, let's move on. Number 4, millions of pounds of public money are spent defending riverside farmland from flooding. Some of this money should be given to farmers to compensate them from taking such land out of production. This would save money and would benefit the environment, since if rivers were allowed to flood, the natural plains would provide wetland meadows and woodland rich in wildlife. Okay. Does anybody disagree with the disagree that this is an argument? Everybody agrees that this is an argument?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the conclusion is correct according to you?
Yes.
No, I mean, this would
Mhm.
save money and would benefit the environment.
Mhm. That is the conclusion?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Anybody agrees with that? With Lalit?
Yeah, we also mark that sentence.
Hmm. Okay. Um, all right. So it's difficult because, when you're in a physical class, we would have asked you how many agree, how many. We could have taken a quick show of hands, but it's difficult to do in this. All right. I think I would go with that as well, that this would save money and would benefit the environment, seems like the conclusion. Rather than some of this money should be given to farmers, which is not a conclusion, which is more of a kind of a advocacy, you know. And the conclusion is for the advocacy. Why would you do the advocacy? Because this would save money and benefit the environment. So at least that's what I think about this. All right, next, number 5. This year, the incidence of gale force in some parts of Britain has been very high. Driest months were in January, February, March. July was very wet. Average temperatures were lower. Why is this not an argument?
Because it is just giving information and
Yeah, it's basically just I think how many 3 sets of facts. But it doesn't make any. There are no inferences from those facts. So that's that's the reason why it doesn't work as an argument. Okay. The North American Wildlife Federation, which sponsors an annual watch for endangered species, reports that sightings of the bald eagle between 78 and 79 increased by 35%. In the watch of 79, 13,000 sightings were reported, 3,400 over the 1978 count. This indicates considerable growth in bald eagle population. Agreed, everyone? Anybody disagrees with this?
yeah, everything.
Okay. Now this is a tricky one, right? Because although there is an inference from the data, it's difficult to say whether this is an argument or not, whether it's simply an inference and not an argument. But because it's an inference, we can still consider this as a sort of argument. But I mean, which this kind of indicates that the line that can be drawn between what is an argument and what is not so clear cut. Um, so this is definitely an inference from the data. But whether this is an argument or not, that's an open question. But I would think that you can still consider this as an argument. All right. Number 7, the presence of security cameras has been shown to reduce crimes in areas such as shopping malls, but security cameras are not an unqualified success. Law-abiding citizens should do not wish to have their. Okay, just scroll down. Activities observed, criminal may commit. Okay. Everybody agrees with this response?
Yes.
Anybody disagrees with this and thinks that this is not an argument?
I have a doubt. Can the first sentence also be considered as a conclusion along with the one security cameras are uh, not an unqualified success?
I think, I mean, in my opinion, this is not an argument because it is against stating separate sets of facts. An argument would be, a conclusion would be something like, therefore, we must have cameras in, in public places, or we must not have cameras in public places. Something like that would be an argument. The what what the point of view of the person who's saying this is not clear. Hmm? They are saying that cameras are not a success, but it is only indirectly implied that one must not have cameras. The conclusion is missing. It's implied, but it's missing in. It's not stated, right? So now it becomes difficult in these cases to call it an argument. It's an incomplete argument. So I would not call this an argument, but again, if somebody feels strongly about it, please um, do say so. Okay, let's go to the next one. Scroll down, please. We would reduce road accidents by lowering speed limits. But because this would inconvenience the majority who drive safely, this would be an unacceptable solution to the problem of careless drivers who are unsafe at current speed limits. Yes? Agreed or no?
Agreed.
Okay, anybody says not an argument? No? Okay. Number 9, in the Victorian era, cannabis was used to treat all kinds of conditions. Now its use, even for medicinal purposes, is illegal. It has been found to be helpful in relieving the symptoms of multiple sclerosis. Okay, now why is this not an argument?
I think it's because it's just different facts.
Mhm. It doesn't have a clearly stated conclusion. Then
Yeah.
why is number 8 an argument? It also does not have a clearly stated conclusion, does it?
Yeah, exactly. Even eighth is it is an unacceptable solution to the problem. So eighth
Hmm.
doesn't seem like an argument or like a
Okay,
conclusion. Sorry.
but if you, okay, but on the contrary, if you restructure the sentence, number 8, we could reduce road accidents by lowering speed limits. This would inconvenience the majority who drive safely, um, and therefore this would be an unacceptable solution. Yeah, actually, it doesn't state the conclusion clearly. It
Yeah,
says
I guess
yeah,
it is
it's
not an
yeah,
argument either.
yeah, yeah. I agree with that. All right, number 10. Number 10, everybody agrees with this?
Yes.
Yeah, actually, number 10 is straightforward because you have an indicator, thus. But you have to check. Just the existence of the word does is not sufficient, because I may say something like it's raining outside. Rain causes everything to get wet. Does one must turn on their fan in their room or something like that. I'm using the word does, but it's unrelated to the premises. Hmm? So the word does is not sufficient, but it's a good indicator for you to check, or for you to identify an argument from simply a statement of facts or information. All right. Okay. Next, go to the next exercise. Can you scroll down? All right. Let's go through this quickly. Just take one or two examples. Okay. Let's take number 2. When choosing someone for a job, employers should base their decision on the applicant's personalities rather than on their skills. What do you have to do here? The reasons for the conclusion. Okay, everybody agrees with this?
Yes.
All right. Number 3, anybody disagrees with option A?
No.
Don't agree, why?
No. Like we agree with that option A.
Okay, any disagreements? Why is B not a good reason?
It still doesn't explain why light skinned people should avoid exposure. It expands but doesn't.
Okay. Also, the word suffer is can have multiple interpretations, right? So dark skinned people do not suffer, but why are they suffering? No, that's not clear. So that's a little bit of ambiguity there. Okay, number 4, installing insulation in your house may be economical in the long run. Right, okay. Anybody disagrees? It's fairly obvious, this one. Okay, so fine. We will check how many of you have submitted this. If someone has not yet done this, please do it and upload it so that we can give you your progressive grade based on this. All right, so now I'm going to do a short presentation on representing quantities. I just share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Is the full screen view visible?
Yeah.
Okay. So this presentation is very brief presentation. Is basically a bunch of examples that that is meant to create a discussion around how data or quantities can be represented through through tables, charts, graphics, images, etc. And this is, this is more a kind of a, we generally speak about it as a graphic skill, but what I also want to highlight here is that it's not simply about the ability to make graphics. It's about communication. To be able to effectively communicate information, which is quantitative, is a skill which is not simply limited to how good you are in doing graphic work. It's also about, it's like somebody who has a good vocabulary, maybe, but may not be very good at communicating clearly, right? So there are two kinds of skills involved here. One is communication skills, and one is the more graphic skills or ability to make attractive charts and so on. They're two different things. What we are focused on here in this presentation is more communication rather than your ingenuity when it comes to graphic design. Okay, so I mean, visual material is of various kinds. We make lots of maps as architects, as urban designers, planners, etc. And maps are provide a certain kind of visual information, which is usually what is called locational information. We say spatial, but it's essentially about relationships between objects in space, right? That's what maps do. The second in this slide is what is called a chart. which is showing quantitative information over time, right? So it gives you a certain sense of trends. Hmm? The third one that you see here, bottom left, is a diagram which shows you the relationships between different pieces of information, not necessarily in space, in physical space, but in conceptual space. And the fourth is the image, which is a picture, which has a lot of information in it, but it is not, but it is essentially a slice of time, right? And this is what photographs tend to capture, right? So we have different names for these things: map, diagram, graph, and picture. So this is these are basically tables randomly picked out from Economic and Political Weekly, and as generally people who make lots of diagrams and charts and so on, quantities expressed in the form of tables like this generally tend to not be the kind of skill that architects and visual artists have. Um, it is, however, what you see in these tables is there is a lot of information that can be very abstractly conveyed through tables like this. And what generally happens in these is these kind of quantitative this tabulation of information in this manner creates does two things. It classifies information. That's why you have these text heads, corporate income tax, personal income tax, cooperative sector. They're actually categories. So it classifies information, and then it provides a numerical figure to compare those categories, right? So that is essentially what these tables do. And I mean, you'll be surprised as to how much you can, people who are skilled at reading tables can read a lot of information, and not just what is presented in those tables, but also what can be inferred from those pieces of information. All right. So it is also a skill to be able to quantify and tabulate information. And there's no reason why, um, uh, we should not be taking interest. Maybe in one of the subsequent classes, we'll do a couple of exercises on tabulating information or reading tables as well, just to develop those skills. All right. Now, many of these tables can also be converted into what we call infographics. Now, this is something that we kind of like to do quite a lot. Now, the reason why people make infographics is to simplify um, the uh, the information that is being conveyed. Also, to use some of the advantages of spatial quality of information, to be able to better express quantitative information. So you're using the space as a way of expressing quantities, right? So if you see the first four, set of 5 squares on the top, they are actually percentage values, estimated deaths, but they are expressed as the number of cells in the square, and that immediately 2%. Okay, but if you see 2 squares out of those 100, you immediately visually see what 2% looks like, right? So it gives you a different sense of that information. And generally in reports that are made by, I don't know, government agencies, private organizations, and so on, this kind of visual information is used quite a lot to be able to very quickly explain, even to non-specialist readers, what that information implies. Okay, what happened to this? Suddenly crashed. One second. Okay, sorry for that. One second. Sure. Okay, so so you see an illustration of that in this. This is basically comparing the lengths of different rivers in the world and different peaks, mountain peaks, to visually illustrate what is the which is the longest river, which is the tallest peak. But what it also does, interestingly, is that it also shows you the profile of the rivers and the peaks. So it's not only the abstract information in terms of length. So when you convert the length of, let's say, the river Nile into kilometers or into miles or something like that, it's an abstract quantity. But in this graphic, you also see the shape of the river, and the course of the river and its form and so on. So it gives you an additional layer of information. So what is important also for us to understand is that when you're expressing information visually, it also makes sense to add layers of information which simply quantitative information does not convey. So that one is not simply converting a number into a graphic, but is adding a piece of information which the number cannot communicate. Otherwise you're simply assuming that this is being done so that your reader cannot, is not smart enough to understand what a number implies, right? So this layering of information is very important for us to understand as one of the advantages of making interesting graphical modes of communicating information, quantitative information. This is the life cycle of a beetle, and it shows in the different months what stage the beetle is at, essentially, in the reproductive cycle. It gives you a few levels of information. It gives you temporal as well as a spatial kind of cross-sectional, in fact, information about the stages of that beetle's life. And again, you can tabulate this in terms of Jan, Feb, March, April, but to be able to show where that creature is at that particular time in the year is also something that this image does very visually and in an evocative way. Now in the bottom you see a chart which shows you the differences in time zones. Now, in India, we have a single time zone. In some other countries, you have different time zones. So to be able to see how those time zones, and if you take a flight from one city to another, what will be the differences in time zones? This is what this chart does, which is obviously, if you have dealt with different time zones, you will realize that this is a very easy way of understanding time zone differences while you travel. Oh shit! Again it crashed. One second. I'll just make a PDF of this. I think there's some problems. So much for fancy transitions. Where it go? PDF. Okay. All right. So these are pulled out from from a UN report which compares CO2 emissions in different countries around the world. And what it does is, what is interesting in these graphics is the way it clusters some of these countries. So it clusters countries into EU countries, G8, OECD, and then it has lists the countries in terms of their overall footprint, CO2 footprint, right? So you see relative quantities by clustering different categories in different ways to illustrate the if you see in the left hand side graphic, the LDCs, that is low development countries, have extremely low CO2 emissions. But there are many more countries as compared to the OECD countries, which are the the richest countries in the world. So that immediately gives you the scale of inequality, which is so essentially a piece of quantitative information is converted into an argument. So what is important in this is that it is not simply information being conveyed, but like we looked at in the exercise, the previous exercise, there is an argument that is being made through these infographics as well. Okay, so CO2 trends and national targets. This compares, for instance, in the United Kingdom, the CO2 emissions, and the dotted line indicates the target, and the total indicates what is actually happening. And so it also breaks down that total into 4 different categories: power, transport, domestic, and other. So you see, okay, which is the biggest contributor to CO2 emissions, which sector? So that gives you what is, this kind of layering of information, which again, you could do this in a table, but this does more than that. So all of these graphics do more than what tables do. They don't simply reproduce the table in graphical form. Okay, that is important for us to recognize. Now, it's also possible to go terribly wrong with information, with infographics. Sometimes what happens is, in the enthusiasm to make graphical information, one ends up complicating or obscuring information more than clarifying it. So for instance, this graphic on the left presumably talks about the pollution in terms, in different years, and it's actually not clear. This is US basically, and it has different exhaust pipes that are replacing bars. Now, unlike that river example, where the profile of the river is somewhat interesting, these different shapes of exhaust pipes are not giving you any different kind of information. They're simply a fancy graphic, right? So essentially what is happening is a simple bar chart would have sufficed rather than. So this is when making something graphical is seems to be more interesting than the kind of value that one can add by converting something into a graphic. In the second example is also the same. This graphic, it's very hard to understand what it is trying to say, because the colors, the lines, the circles, all of those are extremely difficult to decipher. So you can also go very wrong with converting information into infographics. In fact, tabulating, if it's easier to understand a table, you do that rather than converting it into a chart and making it more difficult to understand, right? So again, these are examples from that same Human Development Report, looking at retreating glaciers. So if you look at the chart on the right-hand side, the extreme right-hand side, you see Latin America's retreating glaciers. And the black line indicates what it was earlier, and the gray line indicates, the gray area indicates what it is now. So you immediately see that something is reducing, right? And in this case, it is the area of the glaciers. So that gives you information spatially, but it also makes it extremely tangible in terms of its value. And it adds to what you can achieve by simply providing a table. How long do animals live? This is a timeline essentially, and different animals are kind of placed on different lengths of that line. And it's an interesting way of expressing this information. Obviously, this is something that can be used for, I don't know, maybe, an encyclopedia or a children's book or something like that. And it can be a good way of explaining this. And what's interesting about this is the way that line kind of bends to, occupy the rectangular space, which is a nice way of doing it. The one on the right is actually connections between different airports, and to see if two cities that you want to travel between, how would you go from one place to another? And that is explained in this kind of a graphic which is useful. Now, sometimes you can also combine two different kinds of information. Here in this, you see a chart, which is actually a map and a chart, which are superimposed. So there are bar graphs, but they are superimposed on a map of a region, and so you can compare different regions and have finer pieces of information within that region as well, right? Over time. So it's time, space, and quantity all together in one graphic. So which is interesting as well. Now this is a sectoral kind of a pie diagram. It's from an old laptop that I had, which is it's kind of the cross section of a graphical representation of the disk space that has been occupied by different things, right? So it's basically a pie chart which is broken down into smaller and smaller sectors to be able to see how much of space what is occupying on your hard drive. So this can be also obviously any piece of information can be represented like this, but it's a interesting way of showing how much share of space is being taken by what kind of thing. Okay, now in this, in the one on the top, this is essentially a timetable of a train in a train station. But what is really interesting in this is the use of the shaded area. When you have these long tables with lots of numbers, you can get lost. So what the designers have done here is simply created these bands which guide your eye while you're reading the information, so that you don't read the wrong timing. But a simple device like that can go a long way in improving readability, and sometimes designers try to do too much and make life more complicated, rather than very simple tricks which you can use to improve how visuals can communicate information. Now, this is a map of the world based on the CO2 emissions. So they've changed the scale of the countries based on the emissions. So if you can see, Africa and South America almost entirely disappear, despite being the biggest continents, whereas some countries have grown really large in size. It's interesting. I don't know if it's really helpful other than just showing the scale of inequality, but yeah, this is another way of doing these things. This is an interesting diagram which basically shows the cycle of urban sanitation, and essentially this is a table. But what this does is it has all the classification subcategories. It breaks up into this into a graphic which indicates the sanitation system. So if you see on the right, reuse and disposal, only 12% of the sanitation waste, human waste, is treated in India overall, aggregate, right? 88% is unsafe disposal. But you also go through the vertical and horizontal subcategories to see what happens at each stage, and what is happening to the waste in terms of the system that it belongs to, pipe sewer system, on-site sanitation, or open defecation, and so on. So these are, again, this is a very simple graphic, but really effective in the way it communicates, right? So anyway, this is all. These were some examples to kind of think about communication through the visual medium and representing quantities. If you guys have any thing to add or to ask, we can have maybe 5 minutes for questions, and then we can close. Anyone? I'll upload this presentation on the Teams folder, so in case if you want to take a look at the slides later, you can. Anyway, the recording will be up as well. So yeah. Okay, then if there's nothing more you guys want to ask or say, next week we'll do 2 more exercises, and again it'll be in teams, and we'll try to find a way of doing the. Did the breakout into classrooms help? Was it convenient or was it painful? I mean, I've tried it once. It's not exactly ideal, but it still works fine. What do you think about that?
It was fine.
It was fine. Okay, so we can do that again next week. I'll just ask maybe one of the CRs to start the meeting so that you can create the teams, the classrooms, and break out into sessions, and then we can probably meet and go through the exercises together. All right?
Yeah.
Okay. So see you guys next week. Have fun. Take care.
Hussain,
Yeah.
why do you use Linux?
Why do I use Linux? Okay.
Yeah.
I have used Linux since the past, I don't know, 16, 17 years. And I use it because it is open source and it is made by people who, it's not proprietary. It's made by people who are essentially users of the software. And something like, so, I mean, the thing is, software is very different from stuff that you use. For instance, how do software companies make money? Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, these guys are dead. I mean, and they're no longer heading their companies. But how did they make their money? They made their money not by selling you goods, but by copywriting software. Uh, the difference between, let's say, a pair of shoes and a piece of software is that the software can be copied, and the person who's the original source doesn't lose that thing, right? So if I lend my shoes to somebody, I don't have the shoes anymore. But if I copy my disk and give it to someone else, that person, I retain it, and that person gets it as well. So the only way the software company can make money is by copywriting the software, even though it has produced just once. So this is it is basically owning information and making money through copywriting. And on the other hand, open source software is something that anybody can make, anybody can use. It also has the idea that you can make your own software, and you're in control of what you use, and that is how most things should be. So that is the reason why I use Linux. And I mean, earlier it used to be very difficult. 15 years ago when I started, there were not very good equivalents to Windows and Apple and so on. But nowadays, I think many softwares are much better than the proprietary versions that you get. Incidentally, if you use Linux softwares, your hardware can be very old, but it'll still work very well. That doesn't happen in Windows and Apple computers. They build in obsolescence, as it's called. Basically, after a period of time, the system either starts giving you trouble, or it fails, or it doesn't work as well, and you have to replace it. All that doesn't happen on your Linux systems because they can use fairly old hardware as well, very well. So yeah, I mean, this and many more reasons. So yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Okay, guys. Take care. Have fun. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye bye.